Hey Lord of the Rings fans, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at something a little bit different, but for that we're going to be also looking at Arnor, the Realm. I know I did a review of this book, but this is the book that really got me going in the whole military campaign stuff. And a few years after this book was released, a group of Middle-earth role-playing fans came out with the Armies of Eriador. This was an essay first published in Other Hands, volume 33 and 34. The link there no longer works, unfortunately. And Other Hands was a fan-based magazine that would have the newest stuff from Middle-earth role-playing. Plus they would have adventures that you could do that were fan-created. And as well as talk about topics. And this was one of the more interesting topics I found, was the Armies of Eriador. This was published probably in 1996 or 97. I can't remember which one. It definitely came out after they reissued the Arnor Realm book and split it into two parts because they found that one book for Arnor was just too expensive for $50. And they split into two different books. I don't know why. They just did. So it starts with Arthedain. And they're talking about the Second Northern War. So around TA 1400, so 1400 to 1410 of the Third Age. And they're also looking at the Great Plague era of 1640. Now they do look at other eras as well. The problem with Arnor is Tolkien gives so much little information about its composition and its people that it's so maddening to not have any details about what Anunimus really looked like, other than we know it was on Lake Evedin, or Evendim, and that Fornos was on the North Downs. We have no real picture of it, which kind of sucked. Or a layout. It would have been nice if Tolkien gave some general layouts about what each city looked like. But this dearth of information is maddening. Also with Arnor, it's military. How was it structured? So few details. The disaster of the Gladden Fields gives us some details if you read the Unfinished Tales. And that's where we get most of our source for the Arthedain, or for the Arnorian military. So this article basically states that when Arnor disintegrated into three successor states, it basically became three feudal states. And feudalism took over. How much feudalism actually took over and was successful is a matter of speculation. There were Arnorian knights, as was in the disaster of the Gladden Fields. But then again, there were also Roman knights too. It was more of a rank than anything else at the time. This article states that the Dunedain were forced to establish a quasi-feudal system from the very foundation, in contrast to Numenor, where they were all enlightened because of the large numbers of indigenous populations. So there were obviously the Eriadorian Northmen and also Dain-type peoples. An early Arnor army would adhere more to the Numenorian practices and traditions with a body of professional soldiers. So in Arnor there probably was a professional army. And in Middle-earth role-playing, they make that army pretty small. I think they 21 Nodigs, so 90 men in each Nodig. So it comes out to like 2,100 professional soldiers, I think it does. If I'm just doing it off the top of my head. With the economic decline of Arnor and later Arthedain, military responsibilities were increasingly entrusted to local lords and their troops, which makes sense. There is another article about Eriadorian population levels. Again, the two websites they give are no longer active, which kind of sucks. Now it goes through the definitions of knight, men-at-arms, manor, militia, yeoman. Like I said, Tolkien gives so few details, but he says that when Valandil took up his abode in Anunimus, his people were diminished, and of the Numenorians and the men of Eriador, there now remain too few to people the land or to maintain all the places that Elendil built. In Daggerlad and in Mordor and upon the Gladden Fields, many had fallen. This doesn't make sense in a lot of ways. Arnor was relatively unscathed during the War of the Last Alliance. Sure, a huge army marched south to face Mordor, and a lot of them died. And of course, over the course of that roughly a 10-year period of warfare, there would have been reinforcements sent as a new crop of recruits. Boys become men during that 10-year time period and are sent as replacements. So there would have been a steady drain on the manpower itself, but the elderly, the women, and the young would have stayed behind. And this article says about 20% of the whole population serving as active soldiers in a prolonged campaign would be a very high percentage. Now the Dunedain, they do not replenish their losses quickly, which is another drain. And women would be loyal to their men even when they die, so they might not remarry. But even if all the soldiers were to fall, 80% of the population would be left intact to recover their losses within a few decades. Even a Pyrrhic victory, only a small percentage of the population would have perished in war. So it's like World War I and World War II, which was catastrophic in the sense where millions of men died, young men died. But as a whole, the UK, France, Germany, and Canada, Russia, Austria, all rebounded within 20 years, population-wise. We know Isildur had 200 men with him. Nearly all of them fell, but that can hardly be a substantial loss in manpower for a realm. Now they're saying there's about 4 to 5 million residents living in the entire Arnor, which makes sense. It's pretty spread out. It's a very large country in terms of size, and they would be spread pretty thin in certain areas. When I look back at this section about Valandal, I think that they weren't able to maintain all the places they thought they could in mostly the east, along the eastern Misty Mountain areas of Rudar. The Silmarillion and the Unfinished Tales kind of contradict each other, for it seemed like Isildur had more men, and the 200 strong guard was mainly Dunedain, but I find that unlikely. I think the Unfinished Tales version is probably the more accurate one, myself, and that most of the men of Arnor had already gone home, and that he was finally leaving Gondor with the rest of the Arnorian knights to take up his rule in the north. So the loss of 200 pure-blooded Dunedain even then would not constitute a huge loss, unless of course the losses were catastrophic during the War of the Last Alliance. Now they're giving figures for population based on Columbia Games Hardmaster supplements. I've seen Hardmaster back in the day, but I never actually looked at it, so I don't know anything about that game. But they're also taking demographic information from a 11th, 12th century feudal state in Europe. So they're saying that in Arthedain, for every 180 people there would be one knight, for every 120 people there would be one man-at-arms, and for every yeoman there'd be one yeoman for every 50, and for every 5 there'd be one militia. That seems about fairly accurate, I would say. Though if you put it in that terms, Bree should have a couple of knights living around it. Inside Bree itself, Breeland itself, there should be some knights and men-at-arms. Well, they do have a guard. So you're talking about population density, average feast size, structure, feudal obligations, etc. Cardolan might possess a greater population, and that's what Miller role-playing does. Cardolan has the bigger population in Arthedain because it has a better climate and better access to trade with the south. But it fragmented into semi-independent lordships, severely crippled its capacity for united action. Such quarrels might have led to the disaster of the relatively strong Cardolani army in the 1409 war, from which the centralized and well-disciplined, well-led Arthedain army, though defeated, retreated relatively intact and in good order. That makes total sense. Also, I think the fact that the line of Isildur died out in Cardolan, and Middle-earth role-playing says that the last king of Cardolan was actually a bastard. So he was still kind of the line of Isildur, but he wasn't. I really wish Tolkien had gone back and given the entire timelines for Cardolan and Rudar, their kings. It would have been nice. So they give a chart for how many people live in a certain area. So TA 1400, Arthedain would have 2 million people. In 1648, during the Great Plague, they went down to almost 1.7 million, and they had 210,000 hobbits. That seems like a lot of hobbits for the Shire, but when you think about how big the Shire is, and they tend to have large families, and because they're so small, they're not going to be as noticeable, that makes perfect sense. And then by the end of the Arthedain period, there'd be 1.2 million people, but only 300,000 Shire people in the Shire. Still, 900,000 people should be able to rebuild society somewhere after the final defeat of Angmar. So Tolkien never says where all these people went. They were diminished, and there were very few Dunedain left, but that doesn't mean they couldn't have rebuilt something, especially in Eriador. using the loon and the elves and the dwarves beside them. They could have rebuilt something on that side of the loon. Bree could have been another center with the Shire, and they could have maintained themselves in Tharbad. But I think Aranarth wisely predicted that if he tried to rebuild Arthedain and Arnor, the Witch King of Angmar would have came back. Even though he'd been driven away, something might have came back later on and tried to destroy Arthedain, the Arnorians again, before they could become strong. That was the whole goal of Sauron, was to isolate Gondor, which was the stronger kingdom at the time, and not allow any kind of relief force to reach it, like happened in the War of the Last Alliance. So then they give us the military potential. So in TA 1400, they say there's just over 90,000 Dunedain. You figure there'd be over 11,000 knights, over 16,000, almost 17,000 men-at-arms, 40,000 yeomen, and a militia force of like roughly 362,000. So you have a total without militia would be 68,000. That seems kind of excessive for Arthedain at the time. But they wouldn't muster the whole force. And there's a long, long frontier for Arthedain to keep a watch over. By the time of the Great Plague, the Dunedain have declined to 50,000, almost 51,000. And you see the knights are down to 8,200, the men-at-arms at 12,400, yeomen at 29,700, and the militia at 267,300. So you have 50,000, just over 50,000 available troops. Now, yeomen and militia aren't going to be called up all the time. So you're only dealing with 20,000 men stretched over a large frontier, or keeping an eye on the interior. By the final year of Arthedain, you only have 42,000 Dunedain, 5,000 knights, 7,500 men-at-arms, 18,000 militia, and 162,000 militia. So you have an army of 30,500. Logistics would be a problem, but Arthedain would have the advantage of using interior lines and could move troops relatively easily through the road networks. Angmar has to cross through open ground and keep a supply line open until they penetrate deep within Arthedain. Now, you wouldn't have all these gathered because it takes time to gather an army. It would take weeks, if not a month, to gather all those forces. So Arthedain field armies would be relatively small, and you're not going to have all your militia in the field. Usually 5% of the militia are called up. Normally, I think they would call up the militia to guard the supply lines and just to take over the watch areas for the men-at-arms and knights who are missing. Yeomen would be called up, but when you lose them, you're losing part of your economic base. So it's double heavy. You're not only missing military men, but you're also missing the economic part. So this article really does go into a lot of details. The Dunedain would have dominated the knightly classes and the upper echelon of the commanders. There would have been a few mixed or indigenous descent, men of indigenous descent. Many of them would have been lesser Dunedain, mixed-blooded. So the lack of numbers corresponds with Tolkien's theme of the waning of the Dunedain. Dunedain reproduce very slowly. Of all the manish races, the Dunedain are more like the elves. And because of their longevity, they don't produce a lot of kids. And then it gives a list of things that might happen with the knight vassal, may be unable to heed the call of arms because of short-term external circumstances, injury, accident, sickness, bad weather. You can be late to a battlefield. Vassal might not want to serve. Pay scutage. Scutage is normally used to hire a small number of mercenaries for the current campaign. I think Arthedain and Cardolan would have hired Northmen mercenaries from Rovania as light-medium cavalry to counteract Angmar's Easterling cavalry. I've talked about this before, how Easterlings would have came up through a trade route between the Grey Mountains and northern Mirkwood until they reached the passes around Angmar from the east and come to the west. It's a perfectly plausible thing. Now, Vassal's term of annual service has expired. He may refuse to fight voluntarily or for money, because vassals were obliged to render 40 days in European society, but of course, strong central authority of the king and the constant threat of Angmar would give the king greater strategic flexibility to call up his knights more often, or people more often. And of course, you got to keep considerable forces to be kept in reserve to protect the rest of the land. You can't strip your northern frontier of troops to face a major threat, because then orc raiding parties or even trolls could filter down and through. You have to keep a vigilant watch of your borders. And on the eastern front too. With the fall of Cardolan, then your southern front becomes a little more exposed. Then it talks about how sometimes vassals also become rebellious and don't want to fight. Now this might have happened more during the Three Kingdoms period, where there was Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rudar. Some of the major nobles might not have wanted to fight or try to circumvent the king's authority, and if the king doesn't have enough military force of his own to enforce order, then things break down. Cardolan, that was probably what happened to it. According to Middle-earth role-playing, the great barons had more power than the king at times, and it really affected Cardolan's ability to adapt. And it talks about the Shire system, which Tolkien would have been familiar with, as well as land tenure, oaths of allegiance to the king. So with all these things in question, the actual Arthedain campaign army strength in TA4 1400 would have been 2,800 knights, 4,200 men-at-arms, 10,000 yeomen, and about 7,300 militia. So you gather that army for 17,100. Sounds like a big force army from that time period, yes. Total without the militia 1,700, with militia 2,400. Sounds like a huge army. Again, the militia would protect the supply line in the camp and provide whatever. The yeoman would be the militia that you could think of it like levels. The yeoman would be like a level 3. Hardened guys who've already been on a campaign or two or faced an orc raid. Well, the militia would be like level 1, maybe level 2. Light armored. The Great Plague, it goes down to 2,100 knights, 3,100 men-at-arms, 7,400 yeomen, and 5,400 militia. So without the militia, you have 12,600. When I did my military campaigns, I didn't gather that much men. Not at first. They were very small armies. I had a mobile field force and then a stay-at-home static force as a whole to hold the line and react to things. By the time the end, there's only just over 1,200 knights, 1,900 men-at-arms, 4,500 yeomen, 3,200 militia. So 7,600 without the militia. Small army. Keep in mind that the Dunedain of Arthedain, would fragmented as they were, always united against the external threat of Angmar. So if there's a major Angmaran incursion, you use like 50% of Arthedain's military resources to fight it. It talks more about feudalism and how Arthedain would have functioned the way feudalism was supposed to work. So the Arthedain army represented in the Arnor book, not counting militia, should be seen as men-at-arms directly available to the king and the great and lesser nobles. These household troops are more or less always on duty and can be mobilized at a moment's notice. However, it should take time, perhaps as much as a few weeks, to assemble the full host of a major campaign. And it's true, you only get the militia going when you need them. Small, independent armies. Alright, that goes into a composition here, and how Arthedain and Cardolan could never really take each other out. Rudar was even harder to take out just because of the distance to get to its core capital area between the rivers. Geography worked in Rudar's favor, but also worked against it when it tried to take over something like Amansul. They always fought for possession of that place. Rise of Angmar sees a shift in the numerical advantage towards Arthedain's enemies, but by 1409, Arthedain was severely outnumbered by their foes. Traditional Dunedain tactics and troop compositions were certainly have changed since the rise of Angmar in order to counter this numerical disadvantage. And they might have used some older Numenorean tactics. So it's possible to base this on the Arthedain army on the English armies in the 100 Years' War. The English were often outnumbered by the French, but nevertheless won 3 famous battles. Much of the blame for these humiliating defeats may rest on the incompetence of the French leadership, but the composition of the English army was also of great importance. So they relied less on knights and more on yeomen, the longbow. So in the course of their long military history, the Arthedain would have developed missile weapons. There is a reference in Lord of the Unfinished Tales of how the Numenoreans used to have great cohorts of archers with steel hollowed bows that could fire long. And it talks about discipline. Bowmen need to be disciplined, while the knights of the French were not disciplined. The Angmaran army orcs were not very disciplined. So there are three main problems. The Dunedain have to fight against numerical odds. The need for effective mass-range weapons that weakens the enemy before melee begins. Large contingents of his enemies, such as orcs and tribal Easterlings, are not overly disciplined and only lightly armored on the battlefield. Sufficient number of skilled bowmen to form a powerful archery corps. And again, Tolkien's statements about the Númenóreans in Unfinished Tales. Shooting bows on foot and on horseback was a chief sport and pastime. It was the bows of the Númenóreans that were most greatly feared. Unfinished Tales, page 170. And this is where you get the idea of archery being a big thing. Very English. And there we go, the mention of the great cohorts of the king's archers used bows made of hollow steel. Even at the disaster of the Gladden Fields, the archers of the Dunedain were still feared and highly skilled. Isildur had too few bowmen for his needs. This would have been preserved in Arnor. In all the battles described by Tolkien, orcs and Easterlings are present. One gets the impression that their most important and successful tactic was a massive charge at the beginning of the battle to break up enemy ranks and then slaughter their fleeing remnants. It's kind of like the French levier en masse. They would use column formations to break through an enemy line, while the British used a thin line, 2 ranks usually. Quantity versus quality. The Arthedain had more quality, while the Angmaren had more quantity. There's a certain point where quantity overlaps quality and you lose. So they're talking about all yeomen may be longbowmen. Archer is lightly armed with light or medium armor, a sword, axe, or large dagger. And the rest of the yeomen should be footmen similar to a Scottish skilcher and pikemen, or the Swiss halberdiers. Makes sense, they're going to have spears, halberds, pikes, scythes, whatnot. Assorted weapons. Ratio of archers to men-at-arms, 3-to-1, 5-to-1. So 1.5-to-1 or 2-to-1, makes sense. Horses. Horsemen serving as light or medium are most likely to be hired as mercenaries. And according to Miller role-playing, mercenaries were used for their inter-scene wars. Struggle against Angmar, the actual size could be hired by king or lord. So everything depends on the amount of cash available to the employer and the number of potential mercenaries available. And they talk about hiring soldiers, mostly Northmen from Romania. Now it makes sense that some of these Northmen would have immigrated or became the descendants of Northmen who had settled in Eriador as mercenaries. I think in Cardol and in the Arnor book it talks about how Feodor had 5 major Northman burghs on their border to protect it. And they would be experienced in fighting Angmar's Easterling cavalry and their specific tactics. So tactics, Arthedain would have the capability of mounting a strong defensive, but inferiority of numbers and during major campaigns would force them to seek the initiative. A smaller army can only hope to defeat its opponents if it takes the initiative. So like I said, when I did my military campaign, I had a small mobile force. A mobile army to cut into, slow down, if not defeat, then at least slow down and hurt the Angmaren force that was coming against me. It's better to hit them further from your home base than theirs, than they hit you closer to your home. So you don't just sit in a fortified position. You use your militia to hold a fortified position. I think I put most of my best militia units in a place called Kingscrag, which was a little jut on the northeastern border. It was there, reinforced it to keep Angmar's attention, while my mobile force cut in from the south, wiped out the orc tribes that were operating in the southern areas, and using interior lines I could shift troops if I needed them. So reacting quickly with flexibility. The Palantari is a great way to communication, though it did fail them in 1409. Now, Dunedain knights are not suited to true cavalry warfare, and this is true with Gondor. Gondor did not have a lot of cavalry. They had the Knights of Dol Amroth, and they also had some medium cavalry, and they also had some cavalry of their own, but they mainly relied on the Rohirrim for their light and medium cavalry. And in Middle-earth role-playing, the Arnor book, they do have the cavalry component of the army is small, very small. And then we go to the First Northern War, which would be no different than any other conflict. Arthedain claims sovereignty over all former Arnor because they have the line of Isildur still. Rudar resisted, war broke out, Arthedain marched to battle against Rudar. Previous experience with Rudar, an average-sized army seemed more adequate to the task, but Rudar was supported by the newly founded Angmar, and Arthedain army suffered a defeat. King Argaleb the first was slain, and Cardolan, which had thus remained neutral, intervened. Together, the two realms held in Weather Hills for about 50 years. Instead of Cardolan trying to reassert itself, they sided with Arthedain, probably because Angmar had orcs, and the appearance of orcs on any battlefield would send Cardolan into a frenzy. Rudar was seen as the more unsavory of the three kingdoms, rougher, less cultured. Cardolan would have more aligned with Arthedain economics than with Rudarim economics. So during the Second Northern War, Angmar and Rudar campaigned in summer and fall. Arthedain and Cardolan, well prepared and trained, had little trouble repelling them. The 1409 war was waged in the winter, and Arthedain misjudged the enemy's strength and the Witch King's ability to project his power across Eriador during winter. It sounds like they came up not through the traditional way, through the empty land, the Oliad. They went through Rudar, down to the last bridge there. They went along the east-west road. Basically, they wanted to, just like Napoleon did during his final 100 days, the Waterloo campaign. He tried to split the Prussian and British army. And he had a little bit of success, but he couldn't finish it. He pushed the Prussians away, and defeated them in battle, but didn't destroy them. And the British held at Quatre Bras and marched in good order to where they found a defensible position at Waterloo, and held. Napoleon came to finish the British off, and the Prussians arrived just in the early evening. So the Dunedain only had an average army, and together with their Cardolani host was defeated. Angmar pursues Cardolani's shattered army towards the Barrow-downs. And when they're doing that, they're also sending raiding parties into the southern downs, as far as they can, into northern Cardolan. And they're also raiding across the Bree. Bree would have been destroyed at that time. And also into the Shire, where the Shire is now. And then when Angmar later turned up again upon Arthedain, the new King Aerfort reorganized and reinforced the main army and was able to hold Fornost. Though it took time to get reinforcements and the situation was desperate when the fight was decided through the intervention of the Earls of Linden and Rivendell, attacking Angmar's forces in the rear. And the army of the Witch King was annihilated. Now they said that, I remember reading that Rivendell was besieged at this time probably, and that Linden and Rivendell brought more elves over from Lorien to help them, and that Linden and Rivendell subdued Angmar for a time. I don't think they tried to take Angmar out. The elves didn't have the strength to march all the way up to Carn Dûm, and you would need an engineering siege train to do so. I think what they did was they hunted all the orcs they could between Rivendell and Arthedain, and then they destroyed any wandering parties of orcs. Now, it would have taken time for Angmar to rebuild, probably about 50 years, and then they would have had a policy of constant pressure along the borders. Remember, Cardolan no longer exists this time, so there's no ally, and you just keep constant skirmishing. Constant pressure demoralizes. Now, the Third Northern War, during the reign of Erevel, Angmar is defeated once more in a major campaign. This is History of Middle-earth, Volume 12, page 195, I've read that. Where the Witch King threw his forces against the Arthedain in winter, but now Dunedain had plenty of experience. Erevel might have had the Dunedain might have had more warning, and were able to fight. So you go to the Fourth Northern War, the Great Onslaught came as no surprise to the Dunedain. They knew about it. They knew it was going to happen. That's why they had that marriage alliance with Gondor. So why did it happen? Vastly superior numbers on Angmar's side, less capable Arthedain subordinate leaders, maybe. That also takes into account not everyone is good. Commanders change over time and become less capable. Napoleon in his Waterloo campaign relied on less capable subordinates. At the same time, Wellington didn't have the same army that he had during the Peninsula. A third of the British army that had fought with Wellington in Spain had been shipped off to the Americas, where a less capable commander, Packingham, was defeated at New Orleans. Wellington went into battle without his best commanders. So did Napoleon. Napoleon was missing a lot of them, who decided to sit on the fence or had to stay home. The American Civil War saw the same thing, where the South enjoyed better leaders at the start of the war, but then as the war progressed, there were fewer and fewer great commanders. in the north finally found their stride, finally found commanders capable of getting the job done. Arvedui was competent, and though a stout defense of the North-downs, he bought many of his people time to escape. Talks about how mercenaries, the Northmen's defeat in the Wayne Riders' War, robbed Arthedain of its primary source of cavalry. Though it could have invited the Northmen of Rovania to settle in Cardolan, that would have made more sense. The available Northman mercenaries were already employed by Gondor in the Wayne Rider Wars, and were later used by a Gondorian expeditionary force led by Prince Arnor. So that's the other thing, Gondor needed them too. It talks about the Banes of Angmar, which might have wiped out Arthedain herds of horses, which is possible, but King Arvedui held out upon the North-downs until the last and fled north with some of his guard. They escaped by the swiftness of their horses. So Arvedui realized the hopelessness of the situation and decided to buy time for as many of his people to escape west to Lindon. So they would have crossed the Lune. Fornos was defended to force the Witch King to use many resources in attacking the strong fortifications of the city. Now Middle-earth role-playing has that the defenders led by the brothers of the Crown Prince Arnor fell in the city. I don't know about that. Arvedui's stand and the fact he fled north saved probably many of his people. Again, most of them probably went south to Gondor. They would have immigrated to Gondor. Some would have stayed. There must have been more settlements than Tolkien or anyone else talks about. I think Middle-earth role-playing does have the Sarn Ford settlements. Bree obviously stays. There would have been smaller places. The Dunedain, of course, have their own villages. Arms and armor gives a list of what type of arms and armor you're going to have. Magic, I'd never use magic. Tolkien doesn't really give a lot of magic in his books, other than Gandalf and Saruman. Banners, heraldry, traditions. The Arthedain army would have a long tradition in military affairs, going all the way back to the Númenórean period. So they can a wealth of military knowledge, just like the Witch King would also be able to rely upon a wealth of military knowledge. So you have the Royal Army, the Citadel Guard, the Royal Rangers, noble armies, okay? Other times and periods. 1640 is the most used time period in the Middle-earth role-playing series, just because it's when after the Great Plague, when the forces of evil are actually eclipse the forces of good. There's still the equilibrium is starting to change. I think the biggest failing with Arthedain was they could never get a grand alliance. Yes, they could get the Elves of Lindon to help them out, and Rivendell to help them out when things were dire. But they could never get Gondor, because Gondor had their own problems with the Civil War, the Great Plague, and the Corsair threat, as well as the Easterling threats. So Gondor could never really give a lot of military aid, and they used the same type of mercenaries as well. But the Elves of Lindon, the Elves of Rivendell, and they never did get the Dwarves of Moria or the Blue Mountains to help them out, because the Dwarves would have had excellent siegecraft skills. Engineering skills that could have helped them out a lot. Even a small Gondorian army would have helped. So I do like how they give numbers, and you can use those for a military campaign, or use the back of the book to give you an idea. I used the military tables in the books and started small. A small Arthedain Cardolan army taking over Cardolini barony and starting from there. But I do like how this article goes through, gives many plausible and examples of what the Arthedain military could have looked like and how you can interpret things. If you can find this online, it is well worth it to read. Anyway, eventually we'll get to part 2, which talks about Cardolan, and then part 3, which talks about Rudar. This is only a 38-page article, well worth the read. Even if you don't agree with everything it says, it is plausible, and it's great to use in a military campaign. But all you Lord of the Rings fans out there and Middle-earth role-playing fans, let me know what you guys think of this article. Have any of you seen this article, read it? And if you can, find it online. I'm not sure if you can anymore. If I do, I'll leave a link in the description below. So feel free to leave comments. Let me know what your thoughts on this are. And until next time, I'm Romantico. I'm out of here.